Hi, I'm Neil Kelleher. In this video I'm going to talk about hip extension and hip flexion, in particular while standing upright. And I'm also going to talk about how to use the gluteus maximus, the glutes, to actually drive hip extension, and how you can also use it to stretch the psoas if you're interested in that and in creating an active psoas stretch. I'm also going to talk about how you can use that same action as an anchor for your hip flexors, in particular the hip flexors that attach to the ASIC and or just below the ASIC, namely the sartorius, tensor fascia, latae, and rectus femoris. So the main inspiration, or the most recent inspiration for the subject matter of this video, was a Facebook video I was watching by Dr. Mark Chen. He was talking about the kettlebell swing, and one of his concerns is that at the top of the movement, people who are practicing at home aren't locking out the hips. And the way he described locking out the hips is using the glute max to tilt the pelvis backwards. And one of the ways that you can tell the hips are locked out is that the inguinal creases are opened or flattened. And one of the reasons he said that this is important, particularly when swinging your kettlebell, and he didn't describe it as such, but one of the things that happens when you tilt your pelvis back with the rib cage upright is you flatten the lumbar spine. And he said this action is important for preventing lumbar shear. Now, I have some thoughts on lumbar shear, which I won't go on into here. But one thing that is important is that with the lumbar spine flattened, what you're actually doing is anchoring the top end of the psoas. And with the spine, with the lumbar spine bent forward like this is actually how you can get a sensation of lumbar shear or discomfort in the lumbar spine. If you flatten the back of the lumbar spine, particularly when, how would I describe it? Anyway, this is a way, with the lumbar spine flattened, what you're actually doing is lengthening the psoas. And with the lumbar spine forward bent, this is actually a back bend. With the lumbar spine having a back bend like this, the way the psoas curves around the front of the pelvis, it actually pulls the lumbar vertebrae forward relative to the pelvis. With the spine bent back, with the lumbar spine bent back like that, the actual alignment of the vertebrae helps to resist this, quote, shearing action. And actually, in a stretching sense, where you can feel a shearing action is if you are doing Supta Virasana, that's a pose I showed earlier, where you're kneeling with your bum between your heels and lying back. If you allow your lumbar spine to do this action, it can be very intense, and that's where you can get a sensation like shearing. But also if you are lifting weights, and if you are, say, doing even, maybe not so much squat, but if you're doing a deadlift with your lumbar spine like this, say either squat or deadlift, there is a possibility of getting lumbar spine discomfort with the lumbar spine in this position. The best way, personally, I think the best way to deal with that is by learning to feel your lumbar spine, your hip creases, for example, your hips. The better you can control these in relative isolation, the better you can deal with things like lumbar shear or prevent them. But that's getting away from the topic of this video, which is actually learning to activate the gluteus maximus to open up the front of the hip creases. So something else Dr. Mark Chen brought up in his video was this idea of making every move restorative or recuperative. I can't remember or therapeutic. So rather than just doing the movements, he's saying, make every movement count towards fixing your body. He worded it slightly differently. And a point I would make, and this isn't necessarily better, it's a different approach, but if you if you take the time to focus on feeling individual muscles, learn to feel and control individual muscles, it's a bit easier to pay attention to the details when you are doing integrated movements. So he's talking about opening the hip creases at the top of the kettlebell swing, and his suggestion was to help build that awareness is to do deadlifts. My own suggestion would be to focus on feeling and controlling the hip crease and the butt in relative isolation, because when you can do it in relative isolation, and then also practice that in a variety of different exercises, you build up awareness of, say, your hip crease and your butt, and as a result, it's not so difficult to focus on the details. It almost comes automatically, because if you focused on all the details in relative isolation first, it's relatively easy to feel and control them in the context of your whole body. And my usual analogy for this is like learning to ride a motorbike. In motorbike riding school, you'll learn how to operate first of all, you'll learn how to balance. Someone will push each other around. But you also learn how to control the brakes in relative isolation. So you'll spend maybe an hour just learning how to use the front brake so that you can do it without thinking. You'll also learn how to use the back brake so you can do it without thinking. You'll learn clutch control. All these are done in relative isolation. And one of the reasons I focus on muscle control is the same idea. By focusing on muscles in relative isolation, you get to feel and control those muscles. You turn that feeling, that ability to feel and control a muscle into a habit so that you can do it without thinking. That doesn't mean unconsciously. It just means that when in the context of some exercise, you can, if you choose to, focus on particular parts of your body where there's muscle, joints, your connection with the earth. You can feel those parts without it being an effort of, how do I focus on feeling that particular part? It becomes almost automatic, or it becomes easier. So as an example of that, for a while, maybe a couple of years ago, I spent most of my routines focusing exactly on the hip creases. So not just the hip crease, learning to open and close it, but practicing hip crease activation, both opening and closing, in a variety of different poses. And as a result of that, watching Dr. Mark Chen's video, it's like, hip crease, that's easy. I know that. I know what it is. I can feel it in my own body. And even though the thing he was talking about was something that I hadn't played with myself, it was pretty easy for me to pick up on it and apply that, knowledge in a variety of different poses. So basically, going on to hip crease opening and closing in the vertical range, and that's a point with the hip crease. In some videos I put on YouTube, I talk about opening the hip crease by perhaps rotating the thigh out to get a sensation of opening, and then to close the hip crease, rotating the thigh in so you get a sensation of closing. But another way that you can work on the hip crease is if you bend your hips forward, you may get a sensation or may get the idea of closing the hip crease. But if you tilt the pelvis back or thrust the hips forward, then you can open the hip crease. So one very simple action you can do while standing, and previously I've talked about squeezing the sitting bones together, and what that can tend to do is cause the pelvis to tilt back, but it also activates the glutes for free. So one thing that you can do is do a slight retraction of the sitting bones. So pull the sitting bones in slightly, but at the same time actively pull the sitting bones down so that your pelvis tilts back. And what I'd suggest is initially, if you've watched the previous videos on sitting bone control, ideally now you have a taste of sitting bone control, and you can both pull the sitting bones in but also spread the sitting bones apart. You can also drop the sitting bones and lift them. And those are the basic movements. As you get more familiar with sitting bone control, you can fine-tune the movements, do just enough retraction or protraction, just enough lifting or lowering of the sitting bones. And you can fine-tune those based on the feel of the movement. So rather than just doing the movement by rote, so-and-so told me to do this, you can do the movements while feeling your own body and adjusting in the same way a musician will, if he hears that one string is out of tune, will adjust that string to suit, and adjust all the strings so that they're all in tune. But anyway, focusing first, what I suggest you could do is focus first on tilting the pelvis back, and you will get some glute activation as you tilt your pelvis back so that you get the hip creases opening. You can squeeze the sitting bones in a slight amount. Notice your lumbar spine flattening, notice your glutes activating, and then relax. So tilt the pelvis back so you can pull the sitting bones down, squeeze them in slightly. Notice the stretching sensation at the front of your hips. You may get some stretch at the front of the thighs, particularly if your quads, your rectus femoris is a little bit tight and in need of a stretch. You may get some stretch at the front of the thighs, but you can also notice any opening at the back of the lumbar spine as well. So that can be thought of as a glute activation exercise. It could also be thought of as a psoas stretch. And actually, one of the ways that I taught that pose as a psoas stretch was to lengthen the back ribs upwards and then use the abs. So instead of using the glutes to pull the sitting bones down, using the abs to pull the A6 up and stretching the psoas that way. But with this action, you can actually use the glute maximus to stretch the psoas. And something else that you could do, lengthen the back ribs up away from your lumbar spine. So something you could do, lift the back ribs up first, maybe pull the A6 up, and then from there, pull the sitting bones down in slightly as a way of stretching the psoas. This activation of the glute is actually a hip activation. It's focused on the hips, but something else is that it can affect the knees. Could be potentially beneficial for the knees depending on how you do it. It may hurt them unless you pay attention. But remember that the glute maximus has a portion that attaches from the P6 or the back point of the hip bone, attaches to the IT band, which from there runs down the side of the thigh, attaches to the top of the tibia. So glute maximus is not just a hip muscle, it's also a knee muscle. It works on the knee. Now when you activate, so doing that activation, using glute maximus to tilt the pelvis back and squeeze the sitting bones inwards, what it does is it pulls the ASIC upwards. You could actually think of it as pulling upwards on the ASIC in such a way that the ASIC then resists being pulled down. And why is that important? Because you have three long hip flexors which attach to the ASIC, as mentioned if I haven't edited it out. Rectus femoris attaches just below the ASIC. From there it runs to the kneecap, and then from there, after crossing the kneecap, attaches to the top of the tibia. Sartorius attaches to the ASIC, runs down the inner thigh, curves back behind the knee to attach to the top of the inside of the tibia. So that's this muscle which passes behind the teardrop of the vastus medialis. Meanwhile, you have tensor fascia latae, which attaches to the ASIC, runs down the outside of the hip bone to attach to the front edge of the IT band, again runs down the thigh to attach to the top of the tibia. So those are all hip flexors, and the sartorius, in particular the sartorius, for it to flex the hip, the shin has to be stabilized against rotation. So sartorius can be used to rotate the shin inwards relative to the thigh bone. If you stabilize against that, you can use the sartorius to flex the hip. If you have the knee locked like so, perhaps turned out, you can also use the sartorius to flex the hip. You could, if you have the knee locked out, knee pointing forward, you can use the sartorius and the tensor fascia latae, as well as rectus femoris, to flex the hip. And that's, in this case, you're moving the leg relative to the hip bone in order to create hip flexion. So one idea that is important there is all of those muscles attached to the ASIC, and one thing that may be helpful is if you, say, activate the glute of the leg that you intend to flex, you're helping to anchor the ASIC. And one way that you could do it is then, with the butt activated, you're anchoring the ASIC. You could then use the ASIC as an anchor for hip flexion, so using your butt and your hip flexors at the same time, so using hip extensors and hip flexors at the same time for stabilized hips, so that you can use it to flex a hip. By the same token, if you resist with the hip flexors and then activate your butt, you can use hip flexors against hip extensors to extend the hip, so you have stabilized hip extension, stabilized hip flexion. That's in particular while doing movements slowly or smoothly, or while trying to hold hip extension or hip flexion. Now, movement is more than just hip flexion, hip extension. It's combinations of movements. In some cases, it doesn't even make sense to talk about flexion and extension. Instead, I'd suggest a better idea is the idea of stability. Where are you creating stability so that muscles can activate effectively or relax effectively when required. So one of the poses I've been working on recently is something I call square lunge. And literally, I started teaching this again a couple of days ago. And basic action is to strongly press the back foot in, press the back foot down without allowing the body to move, and then from there, lifting the knee. And what you can find if you do this pose, if you press the foot down strongly without allowing the body to move, you'll get strong activation of the hip flexors in the front of the thigh. You can feel the pull on the ASIC. You could also feel the pull. So both the hip flexors and the hip extensors are working, and they stay working as you lift the knee. So this can be a good exercise for strengthening the knee. If you do be careful of the knee. Do it slowly and smoothly because it can be stressful on the knee. If you do it without care, without regard, you can damage the knee. So I like to teach this exercise doing it, pressing the foot down slowly and smoothly, lifting the knee slowly and smoothly, but as well, slowly touching and then relaxing, so all actions are slow and smooth. But going back to this idea of opening the hip crease. So one thing that I started doing after watching the Cheng video, is actually using more hip extension in this pose. And why do that? Well, let's talk about it first. So if I extend the hips here first so I can feel the glute activating, I fine tune it so I can feel my sitting bone pressing inwards relative to the thigh. And to do that, I can either move the leg relative to the hip to squeeze the sitting bone inwards, or I can turn the pelvis relative to the leg, this leg, to get the hip bone to squeeze inwards. But at any rate, what I can do is I can use the glute of this leg to tilt the pelvis back to extend this hip. So with this active, it's causing the ASIC to move upward, so the ASIC resists downward movement. That gives these muscles, the hip flexors, tensor, fascia, latae, rectus, femoris, sartorius. It helps to anchor those muscles so that they can work on stabilizing the shin against rotation as I lift the knee. And that's an important point about the sartorius and tensor, fascia, latae in particular, is they can work to rotate the shin relative to the femur, so they work on knee rotation. So with both muscles anchored, they can actually work against each other to help stabilize the shin against rotation. What that means is that your knee joint is stabilized against rotation. So it can actually make it, if with the butt activated, don't forget that the butt also can work on the top of the tibia. With the butt activated, with the pelvis tilted back, with the ASIC anchored, it can actually make it a bit safer on the knee. And again, I say it can make it a bit safer. Depends on how tuned in. It helps to focus on feeling these different joints while you're doing these exercises so that if there are problems, you can stop what you're doing and fine tune the movement so that you alleviate any problems. So this video was basically inspired by a video which talked about the kettlebell swing, and you don't even have to do the kettlebell swing to benefit from this information or to experiment with it. One thing that you could try doing, straighten the knees, from there tilt the pelvis back, so feel your glutes activating, from there lengthen the spine, and then relax. Straighten the knees, tilt the pelvis back, lengthen the spine, and then relax. You could try doing that on one leg, focusing on the straight leg. Straighten the leg, tilt the pelvis back, lengthen the spine, relax. Straighten the leg, tilt the pelvis. So straighten the leg, tilt the pelvis back, lengthen the spine, relax, and then you can try that on the other leg. Straighten the leg, tilt the pelvis back, lengthen the spine, relax. Straighten the leg, tilt the pelvis back, so feel your glute activating, lengthen the spine, and relax. And possibly when you're lengthening the spine, you may feel, for me, my transverse abdominis activates to help support the lumbar spine while I'm straightening it. So a point there is to notice the sequencing of the actions. Straighten the legs, so working from the ground up, straighten the legs, tilt the pelvis back, lengthening the spine. So you're doing your knees, your hips, and then your spine. Presumably you could also then do your arms. Now another important point is that I've talked in some of the previous videos, I've talked about the idea of balance. So if you draw the sitting bones in, also practice drawing the sitting bones out. If you are tilting the pelvis back, as in hip extension, also practice hip flexion. And one way that you can balance this particular activation, so we're tilting the pelvis back, slightly pulling the sitting bones inwards, opening the front of the hip crease. So one way that you could balance that action is with the knees bent, tilt the pelvis forwards, close the front of the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. You could do the same thing while with the knees straight. And this might take a bit of practice, but if your flexibility is limited, come up a little bit higher so you have some room to move. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. And it may help to shift your weight forward so as you close the hip crease, you can pivot your heels out or in as you need to. You could do the same thing on your heels, move the forefeet in or out as you need to. But close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. You could try both actions at the same time. Close and spread, relax, close and spread, relax. If you wanted to, open the back of the knees, close and spread the sitting bones, relax. Open the back of the knees, close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. Open the back of the knees, close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones even, lengthen the spine, and then relax. So those aren't really any specific poses, but that's, I guess more importantly, that's a way that you can sort of work on first focusing on isolating a muscle activation and then integrating it, and that's actually an important idea. The goal of muscle control isn't to say just focus on activating and relaxing a muscle in isolation. It's a tool. It's a tool to help you feel and control your whole body all at once without having to think about how to do it. And again, the idea is like taking a motorcycle or even driving lessons. You take lessons to drive a motorbike so that when you're actually on the road, you don't have to think about how to apply the brakes. If a situation demands that you need to apply the brakes, you do it without thinking. It happens almost subconsciously. It's like there's a habit that you've created by learning how to operate the brakes. There's a little subconscious unit inside of yourself that as soon as it detects that you need to apply the brakes, it does it automatically. You don't have to think, how do I stop? And for me, a real example of this is when I first got on a motorbike to ride it, I didn't know how to ride a bike. And so I went up the gears. I went first gear, I was in first gear, started the bike, second gear, third gear, all the way up to fourth gear. And I was like, great, I'm going. And then the road started to turn to the right and the bike kept going straight because I didn't know how to turn the wheel. I didn't know how to turn I didn't know how to steer the bike. I also didn't know how to use the brakes. So the idea of these muscle control actions is to help you learn parts of your body in relative isolation so that you can then use it in you can use that ability to feel and control particular muscles in the context of a whole. And then when working towards various poses, what you can do if you're working on integrating particular muscle control actions, you can sequence the activation. So we did this basic exercise, knees straight, tilt the pelvis back, lengthen the spine. We sequence those activations so you could focus on them one at a time. So eventually what it's going to end up being like is just this action. You do everything all at once. Relax. Straighten up with the hips extended. Relax. Straighten up with the hips extended. After sequencing the activations enough times, if you work at it slowly and smoothly and focus on feeling each part, it can then be easy to do this. You can make fine-tuned adjustments without thinking about how to do it, but while at the same time feeling your body as a whole. And I haven't practiced this one, but same thing can apply here. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, relax. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, lengthen the spine, relax. Close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, lengthen the spine, relax. Once I get a feeling of that, I can do it all at once. Relax. All actions at once. Relax. All actions at once. Relax. And then trying it with the knees straight. So straighten the knees, spread and lengthen, relax. Straighten the knees, spread and lengthen, relax. But I work towards doing that by first sequencing the activation. So knees, close the hip crease, spread the sitting bones, lengthen the spine. I'll do that any number of times and then try and see if I can do it smoothly as one action. And yeah, that's basically it. So I'll see if I can do it as one action. And if there are problems, then I'll go back to the sequential activations, maybe playing with the order of the sequencing if needed to, or maybe isolating particular actions if I'm having a problem so that I can fine-tune that particular action. And so that basically is muscle control, the point of muscle control in a nutshell. So that's it for this talk. Rambled on. Hopefully there's a point to all of that, basically explaining my take on muscle control. But if you are interested in a set of routines for working on hip crease control, opening and closing the hip crease, I've included a link in the description block, in the description box. So that's a set of, it's actually 5 routines. They're about an hour long, hour or longer. And the idea of those routines is to help you build up hip crease awareness and control, and hip joint control in general. There's a couple of other techniques in there as well, but it's in a set of routines. So rather than having to listen to all this theory, me babbling on, you can just follow these routines and at the same time get an experience of your hip crease in combination in different types of actions, but also in combination with different different control, muscle control actions. So basically you can see how I work towards improving muscle control and also fine-tuning muscle control and not getting locked up on one particular way of activating muscles, but experimenting with different muscle control techniques so that you get a better feel for your body. So that's 5 routines, and there's the option to, it'll either be as a course or there may be an option to download it. But anyway, check out the description box if you need a few more details and ask a question. But apart from that, thank you very much for watching. I do hope this was helpful. Namaste.